You are listening to the Centropic Oracle, an audiobook podcast of science fiction and fantasy short stories that make you think and feel.
Planting Seeds by C.B. Droege. After removing and stowing his silvery embarkation suit, Johnny had briefly considered retiring directly to the cabin he'd bought for the voyage, but followed the signs to the common room instead. There, at least, he could find some food and Eto. The food was bland, and the Eto was a bit strong for Johnny, but he had gotten used to substandard fare. There were occasional galleys that served up nice food, especially if their cooks had lived through the flare and had adapted with the changing times. But mostly the cooks were listless, pessimistic people who just reheated the protein packs from the Yoon and only knew how to use one spice, usually salt. He looked out the portal as he ate. The town of Bering was already disappearing into the mists. It sat silent under its dome, small squat rectangles surrounding the central tower, its silhouette distorted by the great curved glass. A young woman came across the room and sat at the bench near him, watching him the whole time. He glanced her way briefly. She was pretty and sparsely dressed in the fashion of the day's youth. She wore tight-fitting shorts and wide suspenders with no shirt. A knit cap covered her hair, and thin sandals were strapped to her feet. She was maybe 14 or 15 years old. Johnny had to look away to keep from staring. "Hello, young miss," he said without looking at her. He could feel her smiling at him. "Is there something I can do for you?" "I saw you from across the room," she said, gesturing to where an older man in a well-tailored suit sat dozing next to a pair of service androids. Her father, Johnny guessed. With wealth like that, you'd think she could afford a shirt. "You're Johnny Networker, aren't you?" He took a cautious sip of his drink, as if it were on fire. "I don't much like that name," he said. She bounced a little in her seat. "Oh, I knew it!" Some of the few other passengers glanced his way at her shrill exclamation. "I heard you were on this ferry," she said. "I've heard so many stories about you." He smiled then, and managed to force himself to look over at her. There was undisguised excitement in her broad mouth and wide eyes. "Which stories?" he asked. "The ones where I bring the internet age back wherever I go? The ones where I'm randomly scattering new servers and data centers across the wastelands?" The girl nodded. "I heard that after you visit a town, they even get YouTube again." Johnny had to laugh at that. "Where did you even hear about YouTube? No one's had YouTube in 35 years. "My uncle." She nodded over at the well-dressed man, who was no longer snoozing. He was watching Johnny carefully. "He's told me stories about vloggers and webcasts and streamers and remote classrooms. He was in entertainment back in the 20s. "Well, I don't do any of those things," Johnny said. "No one can do those things." "What do you do?" Johnny looked her in the eyes and thought for a moment. How to explain to someone born at least 20 years after the flare? Somehow, he'd become a hero to the people of the wastes, a drifter who spread enlightenment. But really, he was just a businessman. Most of these little towns in the wastes had computers, but none of them had networks. And he was good at networks. He could found a new company in a little town, get them an intranet up and running. Someday he would control a major data infrastructure. How could he explain investment and growth potential and claim staking to a person who has never even known a corporate bank? "I plant seeds," he said finally. "My uncle says you work for the Yoon. Is that true?" "I don't work for anyone but myself." "Will you visit Terrace?" "Is that where you and your uncle live?" "No, we're from Olympia. We have a library which still runs an old satellite uplink." "What's in Terrace, then?" "My brother." "I see." "If Terrace got a net connection, I could talk to my brother again. It's been so long, and since the post stopped running last year." She trailed off as her uncle approached, flanked by the two androids. Up close, his suit was not as nice as it had looked from across the common room. It was too small and worn thin at the knees and elbows. The androids were worn-looking also, though he must have some resources to be able to maintain and power them. "Young lady, I believe it's time we retire to our cabin," he said in a dull, fried voice.
"Uncle Tim," she exclaimed, "you know who this is?"
"I'm familiar with Mr. Chapman," the man said, then turned to address Johnny directly. "You do good work, sir." Johnny stared at the man, trying to place his plump face somewhere in his past, but he couldn't remember. "Thank you," he said, feeling suddenly overburdened. He glanced about to see if any of the other passengers were paying attention. They didn't seem to be. "I worked with Crawford on the Reclamation and Growth Project back in '38, the uncle said. "He frequently spoke highly of your skills." Johnny didn't know how to respond to this, so he only nodded. He hadn't thought of his mentor in many years. The man held out his hand to the girl, who took it and stood. "Good night, Mr. Chapman," he said. "Good night," Johnny said, as cheerfully as he could muster. The girl only smiled broadly again. When they were gone from the room, Johnny slumped as if deflated. He took another bite of his salty protein mash and washed it down with a careful sip of Eto. Out the portal, Bering was no longer visible. Mentally, he added Terrace to his list. There was so much work still to do.
We hope you enjoyed Planting Seeds by C.B. Droege, read by the author. If you'd like to learn more about the author and narrator of this story or make a donation to them, follow the story page link in the description. Pledge your support to us on Patreon for cool rewards and to help us bring you more stories. If you would like to submit a story for consideration or apply to be a narrator, a link to our submission guidelines is in the description.